So we're thinking about 2024 as the year of living dangerously, given all of the existential and random bits of chaos that have already come onto the world stage over the last few years. Going into next year, and given some of the conflicts we've all experienced this year, it's hard to imagine that things could get even more tilted, but there's a distinct possibility they could. So we thought we would talk about all of those things, how we got here, and how we might emerge on the other side. Not that we know anything, but we're going to give a good approximation of it to all of you, I hope. So Nisid, let's start by talking about the chaos at hand and conflict at hand in Gaza. You've been watching the Middle East for a long time. You've written about Gaza currently for us in a number of different ways. How are you thinking this is going to play out? Is it too soon to tell? And how much of it surprised you?
Oh, I think like many people, the October 7th attack surprised me. I don't think the Israeli response has been that surprising. I think after suffering what felt like a near existential blow, any nation would have responded with a great deal of anger and with a fierce determination to restore deterrence. What is a little bit surprising, and I think hopeful, is that we're a month into this now, and the conflict has not expanded. There's been some fighting up in the north with Hezbollah. Iranian officials have been making various threats, but diplomacy behind the scenes, deterrence in the form of U.S. carrier groups sent to the region, has, thus far at least, been able to prevent the worst, which would be this conflict spreading to the region, disrupting oil supplies, dragging in the U.S. and Iran, and so on. So in that sense, there's something relatively hopeful about this. The problem is, it's not clear, I think, to anyone, perhaps even the Israelis themselves, what the end goal is here. When they want to destroy Hamas, they want to dismantle its infrastructure in Gaza. They don't want to allow Hamas to have any role in any future governance of Gaza, all of which are legitimate and I think understandable goals. How do you measure those is unclear. How long it will take, how long the U.S. has to protect Israel diplomatically until it can accomplish those goals, I think are all very, very uncertain still.
But in your mind, diplomacy, at least backdoor diplomacy, has an effect.
I think it must. I mean, you can look at Anthony Blinken's trip to the region and say, well, he didn't get much from Arab nations, right? They're still pressing for a full ceasefire. They are refusing to sort of support Israel even a little bit publicly. The U.S. can't go in the region and dictate behavior anymore, right? If we ever could, it's certainly not possible now. But again, Iran has various reasons not to expand the conflict, but also reasons that it might seem in their interests. The fact that they haven't yet, I imagine, has quite a bit to do with diplomacy and deterrence as well. Possibly diplomacy by the Chinese as well. I mean, China has more influence over Iran than the U.S. does at this moment, and it would not behoove. I mean, China has no interest in seeing the conflict expand either. So I would imagine they're speaking to them behind closed doors.
John, when we were here last year, you interviewed Zelensky, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the conflict front of mind. It hasn't receded, but it's certainly been overshadowed recently by Gaza. But there it is. It's an ongoing conflict. It's reordered alliances in Europe. It's revitalized NATO. It is getting people to contemplate being as robust towards Russia as Russia has been more outwardly. How do you see that playing out now that we've got yet another front, if we were to call it that, in global conflicts?
I think you're right. I mean, there is definitely, you heard it with Hillary Clinton, there is pressure in Congress, there's pressure on the campaign trail that because of what's happening in Israel and Gaza, alongside other imperatives, everything from border to spending money generally, there are people inside America who are saying maybe we shouldn't do so much in Ukraine. And indeed, I think one of Putin's main aims at the moment is to wait it out and to see what happens either in Congress or potentially, again, as Hillary Clinton pointed out, in the presidential race to give him some hope. And it does feel, in terms of the conflict, that Ukraine had this opportunity during the summer. Some people say they sort of broke through at one stage in June, but they did not consolidate it. and it's settled into something of a ceasefire, well, not a ceasefire, a stalemate, but with Russia kind of beginning to have some superiority, certainly in terms of people, possibly in terms of drones, and also on top of that, with these new missiles from Iran, inevitably, that have the ability to hit Ukrainian infrastructure. So in terms of, are we moving towards a kind of a scene where you could imagine a ceasefire there, I think you're probably looking at the end of the winter, because either the Ukrainians will, by that stage, have managed to keep the Russians moving around enough that it gives them another chance to break through, but if the Russians have merely rebuilt their defenses, then we're back in the stalemate thing. But on top of it, I think that's the one moment where you could see both sides realizing that they perhaps could not achieve their full goals. And again, very similarly, I think, but that in the Ukraine conflict, there's no doubt that China could do a lot if it wanted to. They're the people who persuaded Russia not to use nukes or to kind of put that to one side. But so far, at least, they tend to look at this as being Russia, this is America's problem. It's Europe's problem. They've got a long border with Russia. Russia's been an ally. Why should they do anything? So at the moment, maybe next summer, but early next spring, there might be a chance of talks, but not until then.
So, Stephanie, John has invoked China and whether or not China wants to play a more proactive and overt role in any of this. China is certainly a reluctant global player. I think it thinks very strategically and narrowly in a lot of ways about its own interests. And then there's this sort of wild card issue since we're talking about conflict, that's been hanging over global positioning and the U.S.'s role in this era, whether or not China will be more aggressive towards Taiwan, whether or not China would ultimately invade Taiwan, whether or not China will continue building out its presence in the South China Sea, its own sort of muscular approach to its neighbors in the region. How do you see China viewing what's happening now in Europe and what's happening now in Gaza, and repositioning itself, or simply playing the cards the same way it always has?
I mean, I think, one of the things that's added a lot of instability to the current situation, to all of these kind of global conflicts, is that we're in that period of transition where China was very single-mindedly focused on its economic transformation, economic development, and was actually very far-reaching, certainly in recent years, in extending its economic influence very globally, as we know, through Belt and Road, but actually throughout large parts of the world, certainly in the Middle East, and very focused on developing investment relationships and ties which would be hard to break. But at the same time, becoming more muscular in the region, as you said, sometimes hard to predict, but certainly very clear in its long-term objectives. Also very clear in its short-term objectives when it came to Hong Kong. That actually developed much faster, the sort of taking of greater control over Hong Kong. I think that was a wake-up lesson for quite a lot of the neighbours. But at the same time as it sort of started flexing sort of geo-economic muscles that it wouldn't have had 10 or 20 years ago, you have quite serious economic challenges at home and a kind of failure to develop a broader basis for economic growth, which is what it's going to need, beyond just manufacturing exports, building up that household sector.
Of which is coming home to roost there right now.
Yeah, and you have that. At the same time as actually, I think the greater instability comes from trying to predict how fast they will be on that trajectory to being a more sort of fully joined up, if you like, superpower that's willing to extend to use its diplomatic force. With the fact that the US, partly because it's been distracted by these things, keeps failing to make that full pivot to Asia. And we heard actually in a session earlier this week from Jenny Welsh, our chief geoeconomics analyst, who was working at the National Security Council, the frustration of an Asia expert that's been waiting for the US to fully focus, and certainly a lot of countries in the region wishing that the US would be more consistent and focused on its approach. We have seen a sort of new web of partnerships and alliances with Australia and other countries, but always affected by the domestic political situation in the US and uncertainty about where the US really stood. So I think it's that combination of and I think we'll probably talk about China in its transition to a full superpower, providing being inconsistent and unpredictable, and then greater unpredictability coming from the US at this time of transition.
That kind of allows us to segue into the subtitle of our program today, which is the role of hegemons and the U.S. as a fading hegemon. I sort of don't believe in the idea of hegemons, but John, you have imaginatively and courageously written books about this. How do you think about the U.S. right now in this moment, and then the broader role of do hegemons really exist, and do they end up making a difference when chaos and conflict are afoot?
Well, two things. Number one, I agree with Stephanie's underlying point, having just been in China for a while, is that from the Chinese point of view, regardless of what they've done in the past, at this precise moment, they think most of the instability in the relationship is coming from the American side, and they fear it's going to get a lot worse over the next year because of the US election. And then once you get into things like Trump, it really moves off. So from their point of view, in a strange way, they are trying, at least vaguely, to look longer term. In terms of hegemons, I mean, it depends slightly exactly how you define it. But yes, I think for a period, America was the hegemon to the extent that America has had the power, and in many places still does, if not always to get what it wants, to stop other people doing things. And that I think, is somewhere where hegemony arrives. If you're a global hegemon, you have the ability, if something's happening, to stop something. And the reason why American power has waned in that result, I still think America is much closer to being that than any other current power, because America is the only power which is active pretty much across all the different arenas. We just mentioned the Middle East. We mentioned Ukraine, where it's entirely pushed by American weapons, not American troops. You look around this space, when you talk about Taiwan, you're talking about the Sixth Fleet. America is the only power in the world which really projects power globally. But there's no doubt that power has waned for a variety of reasons. Some political, when you set a line in the sand, as Obama did, and you let someone cross it and you don't punish it, that again weakens your authority. Partly because China's come up as well. Other powers have emerged. I don't think America is likely to return to the same level of power that it had, say, at the end of the Cold War or back in the 50s.
Can I just say as well, I just think one of the things, and maybe I've just been to too many G20s and I'm too much of an economist at heart, but, especially for people in this room, there's another side to this, the sort of hegemonic role, which actually can outlast, even if you're no longer the sort of dominant military power. You can still be the one that sets the table in international organizations and determines the direction of those kind of major multilateral institutions or groupings, whether it's the G20, G8, IMF, World Bank, and actually gets things done that are important for business. And I sort of saw, so in my time, whether at Treasury or in as a journalist, you kind of see the rise and fall of the G20, but also the rise, or certainly the decline of US influence in places like the IMF, where I think that's one thing that I would worry about, that the inability to reach agreement on even quite boring stuff that really matters to business, or on kind of global economic priorities, trade, the lack of a single actor to sort of drive decision-making, not necessarily determine the results of every single decision, but set the terms of the debate and do some coalition building and wield a veto if necessary. I think that's almost as important for the global economy.
But I think a lot of that is self-done. America decided
to withdraw.
America's decided to withdraw from some of these things. It's America which has said, look at the IRA. It said we want America first. So the idea that I think America's forsaken in some ways that ability to project power through international groups, especially in trade. Look at all the trade deals that America has rejected or pulled out of. Yep. That is the ultimate sort of soft power way for a hegemon to hang on to things. A rules-based organization which everyone signs up to, but you are the kind of backer of. It was the same when Britain ruled the waves. It was the same idea that the Royal Navy policed the idea of free trade or tried to stop slavery or whatever it was, but there was a basic compact of nations. They all agreed to things. America had that, and some, at least on the economic side, yes, some of it is because other powers have come up, but another bit of it is because America has very obviously said, America first through Trump, and then in some ways Biden has not retreated from that at all.
One thing he has done, though, and I think this is a great strength of America, is if you look at the U.S. versus China, in whatever statistic you want to look at, GDP growth, market share, whatever, that's one thing. But what you're actually talking about is the U.S. and its allies. Its European allies, its Asian allies. Economically, militarily, technologically, that grouping far outweighs in clout China or any other power in the world today. And one thing the Biden administration has been good at is nurturing those relationships, tightening them with the U.S., but also you see them now improving their relationships with each other as well, right? So Japan and the Philippines developing defense ties, Japan and India, and so on. And maybe this is partly insurance against what happens in the U.S. election next year. But it's an overall good thing for like-minded countries who look to the U.S. for some degree of leadership, but also just share values to be strengthening their ties with each other.
But, another factor in this, though, when we're talking about, the U.S. stepping away from trade relationships or the IMF not being as potent as it once was, I also think the global South is looking at these international actors in an era when there's more transparency around cause and effect and just access to information. And I think the free trade globalization regime has come into question starkly. I think it's one of the reasons there's political upheaval and friction in so many places is I think workers aren't buying the myths. I think other international actors aren't buying the myths that globalization in and of itself and free trade in and of itself are unmitigated virtues. And I think I think we're in the early stages of resolving that. I think there's going to be a burden on advocates. I think we're already seeing it politically because there's a long history in which, yes, free trade has been liberating. Free trade has knitted the world together. Globalization, we're all here together because of globalization. And yet there's been some real downsides to working class residents globally, and that's now expressing itself politically. And it's going to be hard, I think, for global players to reclaim the high ground around that particular argument.
Yeah, and I think, to John's point, there's a questioning of US hegemony, again, in these more kind of financial and economic spheres, and you saw a kind of another round of it in response to the sanctions on Russia and the unprecedented decision to seize the sovereign assets of the Russian central bank, which led to a whole other, it's almost like we didn't realize you could do that, well, we don't want you to do it to us. There was a whole sort of circling of that, but to the extent that the US and the US's allies are kind of shocked and concerned by that, some of the biggest critics of those same institutions, that same model of globalization have been inside the US itself. And within the Biden administration, it's the bit of Trumpian economics which has been most fully developed and exercised is the suspicion in the US, the suspicion in the Council of Economic Advisors of this basic case for trade with lower income countries, and for that the US becomes stronger by trading more with the rest of the world and particularly with developing economies. That is not the prevailing belief of quite a lot of people in the White House now. They actually think it has made American workers, particularly American workers, more insecure and affected the social fabric in a negative way. So I think you're completely right, but it's not. It's the whole world, including large parts of the administration, that are questioning that case.
How do you see that playing out, Nisid? How does this idea of the sort of 1990s pipe dream of technological progress, increased globalization, greater free trade, and it lifts all boats, and then the realization how that's landed in the early 2020s. How do you see some of that getting sorted?
Well, I think most obviously you see it in the rise of populist authoritarian leaders around the world, right? Who are nativist, who can appeal to sort of blood and soil arguments about they're very Trumpian in this way, that those others out there are taking advantage of us. But I think it's important to remember too that the global South actually are probably some of the strongest champions of globalization, right? I mean, these countries have grown based on trade and export. And, yes, that model is changing now, and India perhaps will not be able to follow the exact same path as China, but embedding itself in global supply chains, global value chains, would create jobs, create the jobs that it needs. These are opportunities and hopes that developing countries still have. I think the reaction to it in a lot of ways is more in the developed world, right? The backlash, but it's coming at the same time as this relative shift in power, where again the U.S. is declining relative to other countries. Countries like India, like Saudi Arabia, have greater economic power. They're exerting it politically as well. They see other partnerships they can have with China, with Russia. They can add to their clout. So, in a sense, everyone's going to be looking to preserve their own interests, as opposed to, somehow buying into a global value. That everyone...
And by the way, I mean, when you talk about the sort of 90s, the technological dream, I mean, there is a sort of schizophrenia even of events like this, where we spend half the time talking about how the world's fragmented and fracturing, and it's, we're going in the wrong direction. But then all the other sessions are about AI and digitalization and how it kind of inevitably is going to bring us all together. And the businesses are focused on that piece much more, as much as they are on the geopolitical threats. And they're, in some sense, they're still betting with their feet that that kind of microeconomic forces of integration that come from technology, from having, being able to use workers from all over the world because they can speak English through machine translation. All of those factors are going to be ultimately too strong for governments to.
But don't you think even that there was an evangelical sort of belief in technology for technology's sake, that it was a sort of a new kind of business that was liberating in an era when globalization was afoot and free trade was widely embraced, and there's a sort of questioning of some of the roots of this even within the business community, and how the business community thinks about communicating its own role in the world and its own place in the world.
Well, I guess that's partly also that all of these altruistic, do-gooding people in that world have also made so much money that people have kind of
and collected so much information.
Yeah, I think liberal globalization is a bit like democracy. It's the worst system apart from all the others. And I think what you're seeing at the moment, it's interesting that China's out there saying globalization's great. What are those useless Americans doing, and why are they hitting us with CHIPS Acts and these things? India, I think, is really interesting. Is that India has some of the highest tariffs, some of the most protectionist. If India starts to manufacture, starts to do all the things we expect, I think you can discover Mr. Modi will probably no longer be quite so keen on fortress this and fortress that, and that will change. And I think there is still, an element about those sort of ancient wisdoms, as I would see it, that still has some power. And you can see it in technology, you can see it in all these different things. So that it's one of those ones where, yes, I think we've got much more sophisticated about different ways that you need to think about it. There was a lot of kind of blind faith about it, I think probably again in the 1990s. But you look at Singapore, this is a place, perhaps more than anywhere else in the world, where you're finding a place which has been quite good at adapting to globalization because it's been clever about how it thinks about education and health and all those things. So I think that there will be, I would expect, yes, there are these fortresses developing, but you wait for 3 or 4 years as these fortresses get more ensconced and the cost of things go up. And people, especially in the global south, those kind of teeming masses, discover they have been cut off from these markets. Then I think the sort of folly of what has happened in the Western world of trying to build fortresses will really come back and hit us.
We're going to have real-world referendums on everything we're talking about in the next year in a number of places. India, as John mentioned, Nisid is going to be one of those forums. What is Modiism, and what's the future of Modiism in against all these factors we've been talking about?
I mean, at some level, Modiism is like Trumpism, and I'm not saying that to compare those two men, but it's a belief in the wisdom and power of a singular leader, right? It's hard to say that there's a Modinomics or some kind of governing doctrine that guides his approach to the economy. It is both protectionist and open at the same time. Its diplomatic relations are both to grow closer to the West, but also to maintain relations with China, with Russia, everybody else. I think they see themselves as a Kissingerian realpolitik power who is owed almost a greater place in the world and is rising to fill that place and will accept help from those who are willing to contribute to that and reject criticisms from people who don't. All that said, Modi is still genuinely, personally very popular in India. His promise of development of concrete, toilets, gas canisters, things like that resonates very, very deeply among people. And so I think it will be incumbent upon him to keep growth going, to keep opening up, to keep producing those jobs. Otherwise, that personal populator might not be enough to carry him through.
And John, the UK, home to shambolic Tory behavior.
Well, I made the case earlier. Stephanie will probably totally disagree, but I made the case. I made the case to Hillary Clinton earlier that Britain is like it's like your nice, sweet old aunt who sits there, seems to be living a perfectly normal life, and then suddenly disappears off as a wild time, romances with several Italian waiters, but then comes back and restores her normal life in a cottage. We're now back, I think, in the sense of having two, as I pointed out, relatively boring leaders. And the choice between Sunak and Starmer may not be an inspiring one, but there's an element after Boris, after Brexit, after that golden brief period of Liz Truss, that we are back in a kind of normal world. And maybe, just maybe, Britain was sort of the Western country that began this descent into semi-folly. Actually, maybe something is coming back. You've got Britain, you've got Greece and Poland, surprisingly realistic, even, one might argue, pro-globalization people that have been winning. That's my optimism case.
That's very optimistic. I was going to ask you about, the rodeo clown-ish aspects of the U.S. political scene, but we've run out of time. So on that,
so I win.
Great, so we're not going to tell them what's going to happen next year.
You'll have to wait you'll wait till next year. We'll tell you what happened. But thank you all. Thanks for joining us.